Hi everyone, here's my contribution to my group's presentation in which we are discussing the effects of U.S. sanctions on Iran. My subject is the effect of U.S. sanctions on human rights in Iran. Before I get started on the subject, I want to first talk about the state of U.S.-Iranian relations to sort of set the groundwork for the subject. We need to figure out first what's the big deal. First of all, why is the U.S. placing sanctions on Iran, and why are allegations of abuse being brought against the United States? As we've all read in Ansari's book, the United States and Iran has had a very contentious relationship in the last 50 or 60 years. I guess you could almost call it an on-again, off-again relationship. Prior to the coup of 1953, the U.S. was coming in and its people were working with the Iranians. There was a lot of U.S. involvement in the oil industry in Iran. And it seemed as if things were going pretty well between the two countries. But after the Islamic Revolution of 1978 and 1979, the establishment of the Islamic Republic, it became very apparent to the United States that its hopes for a westernized democratic Iran were being crushed, and that obviously put a strain on the relationship between the two countries. The hostage crisis and the Iran-Contra scandal further put a damper on that relationship. Where the two nations are today, it's obviously all over the news about Iran's nuclear program, concerns over the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in that country, what Iran intends to do with it. The United States continues to be concerned about the hardcore conservative Islamic government that is currently in place in the nation. All that creates a contentious relationship. There's no question that these two nations are not on good terms. And it almost seems inevitable, especially when one nation, the U.S., places sanctions against Iran, in this case to speak out against its nuclear program. It really is inevitable that allegations of abuse in some form, in this case human rights abuse, it's inevitable that it's going to come up. In my research on this subject, I found that there are two sides to this issue, or two groups that focus on these allegations of human rights abuse. And it was a little hard to research this topic just because it is such a controversial issue. It's hard for Americans to admit that their nation, the freest nation in the world, may be in fact abusing the rights of the Iranian people by prohibiting the sale and distribution of much needed medication and food in their nation. There really isn't a lot of quantifiable data on this subject that says the U.S., through its sanctions on Iran, has has prohibited the sale and distribution of medication, of X amount of medication and food, and it has affected X amount of people. Those numbers really aren't there. So a lot of the arguments on either side are done on hearsay, are done on specific political and social agendas. All right, the first side obviously says that the United States is very wrong in placing these sanctions against Iran because it directly affects the Iranian people. The main argument says that U.S. sanctions, either inadvertently or not, prohibit the Iranian people from getting medication, life-saving medication and food staples like fruit and sugar. The National Iranian American Council has published several articles, several reports on this abuse. And it reported in a recent article, it reports that the Asian Law Caucus argues that due to U.S.-backed prohibition of the sale of certain medications to Iran and an oil embargo that limits Iran's GDP, Iranians consistently do not have access to such necessities as medication and food staples. This is caused by the U.S. Bureaucratic system that has essentially devolved into a gargantuan Byzantine. This is a quote from the report published by the Asian Law Caucus. It calls the U.S. bureaucratic system that backs these sanctions Byzantine system that has unclear barriers and serious penalties for violations, and in which Iranians, even though those living in the United States, are unnecessarily penalized for no other reason than their nationality. So their argument is that the United States necessarily isn't focused upon denying the Iranian population the access to medication and food, but the system in America is such that it's inevitable that these abuses will occur. The NIAC reported that while sanctions by Congress don't necessarily target the sale and distribution of food and medication, sanctions passed by executive order under the Obama administration against Iran's banking system do not have such provisions in place. So that is where the abuse comes in place. Because according to this report, according to measures passed by the White House under President Obama, Iranians no longer have unrestricted access to medication and food. Now this issue has been raised primarily by human rights groups around the globe, by the UN. The U.S. government is largely silent on the issue. In October 2012, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon published a report noting the hardships that had been placed upon the Iranian population because of U.S.-backed sanctions. And he noted that even companies that have obtained the requisite license to import food and medicine are facing difficulties in finding third world banks to process the transactions. Owing to payment problems, several medical companies have stopped exporting medicines to the Islamic Republic of Iran, leading to a reported shortage of drugs used in the treatment of various illnesses, and he lists a number of illnesses. The interesting thing to note, or the important thing to note in this, is that he talks about the reported shortage of drugs, and that's an issue that I found in my research. As I stated before, there really aren't any hard numbers that I can look at and say, okay, well, this amount of Iranian people are denied access to medication and food because of U.S. sanctions. That certainly presents a problem in analyzing the situation and coming up with a solution to the problem. I'm not at all denying the fact that the U.S. Through its sanctions is inadvertently denying Iranians access to food and medication. I'm not denying that at all. I'm just saying that it's hard to look at, it's nearly impossible to look at hard numbers and saying for a fact that this is happening on a widespread basis. So you have members of, on the other side, you have members of the U.S. government saying that the Congress has exempted, that Congress has guidelines in place to prevent such abuses. For example, the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000 exempts such basic necessities as food, medication, medical devices, and agricultural tools from sanctions. Recent sanctions such as the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2011, the Iran Threat Reduction and Syria Human Rights Act of 2012 all include clauses that reiterate that exemption. So on the other side of the argument, you can make the case that because the U.S. has these guidelines in place that that provide exemption of food and medication, that there really is no way that such abuses are taking place in Iran because of U.S. sanctions. Another argument that can be made is that it is difficult to pinpoint the root or the cause of these abuses in Iran. It is a well-known fact that the Iranian government currently in place has and continues to abuse the rights of its people. There are many instances in which government officials have targeted dissidents, targeted juveniles, and has tortured them, placed them in jail for an indefinite period of time, and has violated their rights. A good example is something that happened very recently. I think on Wednesday or Thursday of this week, the wife of the Iranian pastor who's being jailed in Iran simply for being a Christian and being a pastor in Iran, testified before Congress about the abuses by the Iranian government, both against her husband and against other Iranians. So it's quite apparent that Iran isn't necessarily blameless in this case. So you could make the argument saying, well, the Iranian people don't have access to medication and to food because their government is prohibiting access, or is using the funds that could be used to provide these staples on other things, such as the nuclear proliferation program. That is definitely an argument that could be made. Now, to wrap up, since I see that I am actually going over time, I just want to reiterate that this subject is obviously a matter of much debate and contention, that the two sides of the issue are very divided over whose fault it is if these abuses by the U.S. or by Iran are actually taking place. And that I am going to go ahead and cut this short because I am over time. So I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation, and I am looking forward to your feedback.